Hello, everyone. This is David from HassleFreeCashFlowInvesting.com. We had a great question on our blog from an international investor who's relatively new to investing, and they really wanted to understand all of the expenses that go into initially investing and then the recurring expenses with owning property in America. So let's start with the acquisition. Probably the first expense you're going to incur is the real estate due diligence on any property you're considering buying. You're going to want to have third-party inspection reports from an inspector to tell you about the physical mechanics of the property. You're going to maybe want to travel to the property and see what the property and the neighborhood are like. When you open up escrow on the property, you're going to have an earnest money deposit, which sits at the title company and is your pledge that you're going to take this purchase contract seriously. That earnest money deposit is refundable if you back out within the appropriate time frame in the contract, or it's applicable to the purchase price if you go all the way through to closing. The closing expenses are going to be variable depending on which area of the country you decide to invest in. What's very typical is there is an escrow fee that the title company charges for coordinating the escrow. In some states, that is a closing attorney. Some cases, it's a title company. That escrow fee is usually about $600. Half is usually paid by the buyer, half is usually paid by the seller. That's somewhat negotiable, but that's usually typically half and half. The other expenses you can look at are title insurance. Usually, and that varies between market, who pays it, whether it's buyer or seller. Very typically, the seller is going to pay for the title policy to the property to ensure that they really did own the property. And the buyer is going to pay the lender's policy. So if there's a lender involved, then the person borrowing the money pays for the lender's policy. If you're borrowing money, you're going to have also loan fees. The lender might have a loan origination fee, which is somewhere between 0% and maybe 1.5% of the amount borrowed. They'll also have document prep fees, which are typically somewhere between $300 and maybe $1,000, depending on your lender. Also, you're going to have transfer taxes. Some of those transfer taxes are state-specific or county-specific or city-specific. So you really have to get down to where the property is that you're buying. Transfer taxes could be very nominal, just a couple $100, or it could be large. It could be up to 1% of the purchase price. Also, you're going to have what are called prepaid items. So prepaid items are recurring expenses on the property that you pay in advance. Those recurring expenses are going to be prepaid interest. Usually the buyer prepays interest till the end of the month they're closing in. They're also going to be prepaying property taxes, sometimes all the way to the end of the year, sometimes just 6 months of property taxes. Also, you're going to prepay your insurance policy, and that insurance policy, usually you're going to pay 6 months, sometimes a year in advance on that insurance policy. There are going to be some minor recording fees when you record your documents. Again, that's a very county-specific expense, but somewhere around $100 to maybe $200 for actually recording the deed. And so those are the closing costs when you're acquiring the property. Sometimes you can ask the seller for a credit for your closing costs. If you're buying an owner-occupied property, typically the lender will allow you to have up to 3% of the purchase price as a credit for closing costs. If you're buying an investment property, it's typically 2% is the maximum that your lender will allow the seller to give the buyer as a credit for closing costs. That's a negotiable item. You can negotiate with the seller who pays which closing cost. When you actually own the property, the operating expenses are very typically, you're going to have your taxes. Property taxes vary immensely, so every specific county has their own way of evaluating property taxes. The property taxes could range anywhere from just under 1% of the purchase price per year to up to 3% of the purchase price per year. So you really have to understand where your property is to determine what the property taxes are for that property. The other big expense is insurance. And again, that insurance amount is going to vary depending on the location of the property. Generally, if you're in a high hurricane zone, you're going to pay a more premium. If you're in a flood zone, you're going to pay a lot of money for insurance. On, say, a $100,000 property, the insurance might be as low as $500 and maybe as high as $1,200, depending on where the property is located and also on your individual credit. So your credit score is going to impact your cost of insurance. The other big expense that you're looking at is property management. Property management is very typically somewhere between 6 and 10% of the gross rent collected, plus up to 50% to 100% of the first month's rent as a tenant leasing fee. The other expenses you're going to be encountering are property maintenance. And the maintenance on the property is all over the board, depending on if it's a new property or a low property. I generally like to use somewhere between $30 a month on the very low end up to maybe $100 or $200 a month for property expenses. Really depends on how big the property is and whether it's in good shape when you bought it and how old it is. The other expense to really consider is any type of a homeowner association dues, and it really just depends on the local market. Who pays which utilities, but almost always the tenant pays everything. If the landlord does have an expense, it'll be sewer or garbage and sometimes water. The tenant almost always pays their own electricity. I hope that helps. You can find some more very practical and creative investment strategies and opportunities on my website, www.hasslefreecashflowinvesting.com.